In the span of just 12 days, the future of the entire Middle East has been rewritten. Right now, the dust is only just starting to settle from a crisis that some are already referring to as the 12-day war, and there are no guarantees at this time that the current ceasefire is going to be able to hold. But already, it's clear that between the devastation of Iran's military and its nuclear program, the emboldened leadership of Israel, and the drastically changed balance of power in the region, the modern-day Middle East will be defined by this conflict for decades to come. So today at WarFronts, we're going to attempt to write our first draft of history and understand the Israel-Iran War of 2025 as it will be understood in the years to come. We'll move from the cascade of circumstances that led the region to this moment, to the tactics and arsenals involved, to the ways that the Middle East will forever be reshaped by what has just happened. Sometimes we have the dubious honor of watching history play out before our eyes, and now we have a perfect opportunity to do just that. So let's make the most of it, shall we? Now, at the time of writing, it appears that the Israel-Iran war is over, or at least on an extended pause. But all of that could still change, so even before we can get into the details, we'll issue that ever-important caveat one final time. Everything we discuss in this episode is accurate to the best of our knowledge and ability as of the morning of Wednesday, June the 25th, local time in Jerusalem and Tehran. Obviously, this is a long video. It takes us a moment to get these out. We're doing our best. Now, hopefully the situation remains stable by the time you're seeing this episode, but in the event that the war's back on already, well, it's a fair assumption that I'm probably recording another episode about it right now. Now, to understand the chain of events that led Israel and Iran to this moment, we could conceivably start as far back in history as 1979, when Iran's Western-backed Pahlavi monarchy was overthrown in the Islamic Revolution. Or we could start in 2015, when Iran and the United States signed a nuclear deal that would prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons in exchange for sanctions relief. Or we could start in 2018, when in his first administration, President Donald Trump pulled out of the deal and imposed maximum sanctions. That prompted Iran to shift its focus from rapprochement with the West toward expanding its ability to enrich uranium and building up the proxy paramilitary forces that formed its so-called axis of resistance: Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Assad regime in Syria, and more, in an attempt to undermine the West across the Middle East in a long-term play for power. But at the absolute latest, this is a story that begins on October the 7th, 2023, when Hamas launched its infamous attack from the Gaza Strip and provoked a massive and devastating Israeli response that still continues to this day. Although the leaders of Hamas never fully articulated the strategic and geopolitical reasoning behind their attack, and certainly won't be able to do so now, October the 7th was preceded by a series of diplomatic changes brewing across the Middle East. At that time, Hamas and Iran's sworn enemies in Jerusalem had normalized their diplomatic relations with countries like the United Arab Emirates and Morocco, putting an end to literal decades of policy isolating Israel to support Palestinians and opening up real opportunities for an economic boom in parts of the Middle East. By the time of the October 7th attack, Israel was on the cusp of normalizing relations with the biggest prize of all, the economic and geopolitical behemoth that is Saudi Arabia. But for Hamas, that was a major problem, not least because Saudi Arabia had also just restored its diplomatic relations with Iran after a Cold War that has persevered for many decades to decide dominance of the Arab world. Not just for Hamas, but for the other groups that made up Iran's axis of resistance. All of this talk of peace and diplomacy represented a major problem. Hamas, Hezbollah, Yemen's Houthi rebels, and all the others needed Iranian funding, weapons, and guidance in order to function. They had each rooted themselves ideologically in fanatical opposition to Israel and had gone to great lengths to make themselves Israel's enemies. But in the Middle East, where Israel could work together with Saudi Arabia to harness their combined economic power, and where Saudi Arabia and Iran could start doing the same thing, Iran's network of militant proxy forces could face an existential threat. To put it simply, a Middle East where Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran are all working toward a common goal of economic prosperity is not a Middle East where there's room for Iran to be sponsoring attacks on Israel. A world where the Middle East power players are in strategic alignment on the question of regional security is a world where Hamas, Hezbollah, and all the others might be far more convenient for Iran to distance themselves from or even dismantle than to keep on supporting. But in the aftermath of the October 7th attack, it became abundantly clear to the world that normalization would have to wait. The attack, and more importantly Israel's all-out campaign against the Gaza Strip, brought the question of Palestine back to the forefront of global consciousness and made it important for Arab capitals like Riyadh to deepen their relationships with Jerusalem. Certainly, any efforts that would link Israel and Iran, even through a middleman, were off the table. Although Western intelligence has since indicated that Iran did know that Hamas was planning an October 7th style attack and had endorsed the idea in principle, they've also indicated that Iran did not know that Hamas would act as soon as it did, and in fact, Iran had indicated that Hamas should wait. Again, it's impossible to say this with any absolute certainty, but in retrospect, the attacks on October 7th appear to have been an attempt to make normalization impossible, and those efforts worked. First, it was Hamas that engaged Israel militarily, continuing to provoke Jerusalem into escalating its operations far past the time when anything resembling victory became unachievable. Knowing that Israel would respond with overwhelming force and didn't seem to care much about civilian casualties, Hamas has been able to use Gaza's civilian population as involuntary martyrs, making it practically unthinkable for the Arab world to engage with Israel anytime soon. Then, after launching rockets into Israel across months of low-grade warfare, the Hezbollah organization in Lebanon came into far greater conflict with Israel, to the point that Israel occupied southern Lebanon directly and killed or incapacitated thousands of Hezbollah fighters. The same story played out in Yemen with the Houthi rebels, who launched a missile and drone campaign against maritime trade in the Red Sea and were opposed first by a Western coalition and then by Israel directly as they lobbed projectiles toward Israeli territory. And in each case, as Iran's proxy organizations were devastated by Israeli military action, Iran became far more vulnerable. Very few weapons are only good for offense or only good for defense, and Iran's proxies were no different. They were a way to proactively threaten and attack Israel, but they were also a defensive tool, building a guarantee that if Israel ever chose to attack Iran outright, it would face overwhelming retaliation from all directions at once, making the idea of a direct attack on Iran too costly to consider. But with every group that Israel degraded militarily, Iran's ability to deter a direct attack slowly diminished. And all the while, Iran became more and more directly enmeshed in the conflict, supporting its proxy groups directly, providing weapons and aid whenever possible, and settling back into the posture of Israel's mortal adversary. In the hours after October the 7th, Iran had started threatening Israel with the prospect of all-out war, and from there, things only got worse. The long Cold War between the two nations showed increasing signs that it could turn hot, and before long, it did precisely that. The year 2024 saw not one, but two direct armed exchanges between Iran and Israel, the first time in history that the two had attacked each other's territory with such ferocity. In the first instance, in April of that year, an Israeli strike on the Iranian consulate in Syria left 16 people dead, including several high-profile officers of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Iran responded with a massive combined wave of kamikaze drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles, and Israel volleyed back with its own airstrikes before international diplomatic efforts could draw down the crisis. Then, in October, Israel assassinated the leader of Hamas in Iran's capital city, killed the leader of Hezbollah and a deputy leader of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, and began a ground invasion of southern Lebanon. Iran reacted with two waves of strikes on Israel, involving about 200 ballistic missiles in total, and Israel retaliated with several waves of airstrikes all across the country. Again, the crisis was drawn down before it devolved into a full-scale war, but the result was clear. 2024 was the year when Israel and Iran finally did away with the idea that they'd avoid attacking each other at large scale, and both nations had reason to feel emboldened by what they had done. In April, Iran's missile and drone strikes had successfully started to create gaps in Israel's air defenses, overlapping systems that are quite robust, but that can only defend against as many incoming projectiles as they have interceptors at the moment of attack. After gathering solid data about what had worked and what hadn't, Iran confirmed that it could calibrate an attack to overwhelm Israeli air defenses in the future. But in October, Israel was able to thoroughly devastate Iran's air defense systems, destroying most of the modern air defense resources that Iran possessed and leaving the country vulnerable to overwhelming future airstrikes whenever Israel felt like it. Not only that, but Israel was able to destroy a critical portion of Iran's production lines to build its ballistic missiles, taking Iranian missile production offline for years to come. So, as 2024 rolled into 2025, both Iran and Israel could find reason to be confident in their abilities, and that would make the prospect of escalation far more likely. And let's just take a brief pause here. I do want to mention our twice-weekly newsletter. It's going to follow the after effects of this conflict a bit quicker than we can in getting these videos out. It comes to your inbox twice a week, and it's free. It's great. You can just sign up below. I'm a little bit biased, but I personally think it's worth doing, so check it out. Parallel to the rising tensions across the Middle East, Iran's nuclear program had, according to international sources, started to evolve real quick. Now, it's a refrain that we'll see relatively often, including in our own comment section, that Iran has been on the verge of building a nuclear weapon for the past 40-odd years. And although the situation is more complicated than that description makes it sound like, Iran has been on the cusp of having highly enriched uranium in its possession for the last several years. It's very important to understand here that instead of simply being a byproduct of Western fearmongering, Iran's enrichment of nearly weapons-grade uranium is entirely by design. That approach to enrichment is informed by a couple of key assumptions: that Israel and the Western world are very interested in making sure that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, and that if Iran actually enriched uranium to weapons grade and tried to build a functioning warhead, that would almost certainly kick off an all-out war against the Islamic Republic. In that war, Iran would likely face the full might of a combined US and Israeli campaign, potentially joined by much of the world, and by the end of that campaign, Iran would probably have neither a working nuclear bomb nor very much of a country left. Instead, Iran has chosen to enrich its uranium to levels that approach weapons grade, but don't actually hit that threshold. That way, Iran can maintain a credible, scary-sounding ability to produce weapon-grade material if it chose, a so-called breakout capability, but it doesn't give the rest of the world quite enough reason to actually start a military campaign. Of course, it turns out that Iran's logic there ultimately didn't hold up under pressure, but that seems to have been the basic idea. Enrich enough uranium that the rest of the world would be nervous about Iran's capabilities, but avoid actually producing weapons-grade uranium, building the technical components of a nuclear bomb, or mounting a warhead into a ballistic missile, all acts that would cross the line, whereas, at least for a while, building a stockpile of partially enriched uranium didn't seem to cross that line. But over the last few months, and especially in the weeks leading up to Israel's strike on Iran, global observers have sounded the alarm on just how much uranium Iran was enriching. At the end of May, a report from the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, indicated that Iran had enriched around 900 pounds of uranium, over 400 kilograms, to a purity of 60%. Now, granted, 60% enriched uranium is still a good way off from the 90% enrichment threshold to be considered weapons grade, but that is an enrichment gap that Iran could cross in the span of weeks if it chose to. And if it did, then that much highly enriched uranium could fuel 10 nuclear warheads. Those 900 pounds of enriched uranium that the IAEA reported were up from just over 600 pounds barely 3 months earlier, suggesting that Iran was rapidly increasing its stockpiles for unknown reasons. Again, even having weapons-grade uranium in its possession doesn't mean that Iran would have a functioning nuclear weapon. To do that, it would have to physically build a warhead and place it into a suitable delivery mechanism, a process that was expected to still take months. But the rapid increase in Iran's enriched uranium stores was still enough to cause a panic, especially considering what else had been going on at that time. When the IAEA report came out, Iran was deep into a series of new nuclear negotiations with the United States, and in fact, it was coming off a 5th round of talks that left both sides feeling optimistic about a deal. To that point, the United States had largely been brushing off Israeli objections to the talks, insisting that there was still room for diplomacy and that Israeli strikes against Iran were unnecessary. US intelligence at the time had assessed that Iran hadn't yet started a nuclear weapons program, instead just producing the nuclear materials that would allow it to start a program later on, and technically speaking, the IAEA report didn't change that. But it was accompanied by another report that accused Iran of having hit a nuclear program in the past, and the one-two punch of those reports together from an international agency that's the gold standard on nuclear matters, well, that was a real problem. It amplified Israel's insistence that Iran was a nefarious actor behind the scenes. It delivered a rude awakening to elements in Washington that had believed Iran to be fully engaged with the talks, and it provided the American Republican Party's class of warhawks with all the reason they needed to start spreading the word across the Trump administration that America was at risk of being played. Israel amplified the report even further in the global press, calling on the international community to take decisive action against Iran immediately. All the while, the IAEA itself was clear, with the organization's director general stating directly that there was no, quote, proof of a systemic effort to move into a nuclear weapon. But ultimately, that wasn't going to matter. In the following days, America kept up the pressure on Iran to remain at the negotiating table, but the mood out of Washington had changed dramatically. Just days prior, Trump himself had been insisting that there was no reason for Israeli intervention. But when he was asked about the prospect of an attack after the report's release, he offered, "I don't want to say imminent, but it looks like something that could very well happen. Look, it's very simple, not complicated. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon." Around the same time, American officials with a history of advocating decisive action against Iran began pushing harder within the White House to allow an Israeli attack, something that Israel was judged as being unlikely to do without America's sign-off. And Iran didn't help its own situation either, announcing publicly on June the 12th that it had built a third nuclear enrichment facility alongside the two facilities known to international onlookers, and it planned to activate it immediately. It would also replace old centrifuges with new ones, rapidly increasing its enrichment capacity, and would consider other escalatory steps too. That announcement came just after Iran was censured by the IAEA as a result of the prior reports. And if there was any question about whether that Iranian claim might have forced the West to slow down for a moment and think more carefully about how to proceed, then that question was answered just hours later when the first Israeli bombs began falling across Iran. On June the 13th, 2025, Israel initiated Operation Rising Lion, a coordinated campaign of airstrikes and sabotage that was meant to incapacitate Iran's nuclear facilities and its military command and control. It was intended to be a surprise attack, and thanks to preparatory action by both Israel and the United States, it was precisely that. According to Israeli officials, the United States had already been aware of the upcoming strikes for several days and had intentionally misled Iran in the global press by allowing leakers to insinuate that Trump had forbidden an Israeli attack until nuclear talks with Iran had failed decisively. At the same time, Netanyahu and his government had made announcements suggesting progress in hostage talks with Hamas, and to help matters further, Netanyahu was scheduled to attend a high-profile upcoming wedding for his son, suggesting that he certainly wouldn't disrupt his family's own plans by starting a military campaign. All the way down to the moment that the strikes kicked off, it now appears that the Israeli and American governments worked to lull Iran into a false sense of security, ensuring that the nation's leaders weren't in hiding and its nuclear assets hadn't been relocated when the first wave of strikes began. In reality, current and former Israeli officials have now suggested anonymously that Israel had been preparing Operation Rising Lion and laying the groundwork with the United States since last autumn before Trump was even elected to a second term. And when the attack began, in the small hours of the morning before dawn, it became very clear, very quickly, that the world was witnessing a strike that had been planned extensively. Israel's initial air attack came in several successive waves, relying on stealthy, modified F-35s, as well as the nation's upgraded versions of the F-16 and the decidedly non-stealthy F-15. They carried bunker-busting bombs, precision-guided munitions, and advanced air-to-ground missiles, receiving in-air refueling from Israeli tanker aircraft during the course of their mission. Operating alongside strike and reconnaissance UAVs, Israeli air power was able to strike several successive target groups. First, stealth fighters slipped through Iranian air defenses and destroyed the nation's defensive batteries, clearing the way for less stealthy aircraft to enter without fear of being shot down. Then, heavily armed warplanes devastated Iranian ballistic missile launchers, conducted precision strikes against many of Iran's military leaders, and started direct strikes on its nuclear facilities, especially an enrichment facility known as Natanz. In the process, Israel also destroyed many of Iran's warplanes, including a portion of its antique but still flyable American-made F-14s and F-4s, ensuring that Israel was able to establish an air advantage that would soon translate into full air superiority. But warplanes weren't the only weapons deployed in Jerusalem's opening salvo. Shortly after the attack began, reports started to emerge from Tehran, suggesting that the Israeli attack included a substantial ground component informed by the intelligence products of years of covert espionage. According to Israeli intelligence sources speaking to the global press after the fact, Israel's foreign intelligence agency, Mossad, had been at work in Iran, laying the foundations of the attack for at least 3 years, cultivating assets, targeting key personnel and defense equipment, and preparing for a series of targeted assassinations and sabotage operations once Mossad received Jerusalem's go-ahead. As a part of that effort, Mossad smuggled large numbers of small explosive drones into the country, as well as other close-range weapons, including small, remotely operated precision-guided spike missiles that could be launched at a moment's notice. Their targets included Iranian surface-to-air defense batteries, taken out rapidly to clear the way for Israeli jets to attack without fear, as well as Iranian military and intelligence officials who would otherwise be instrumental in coordinating Iran's rapid response. They also targeted Iranian vehicles that would be used to launch ballistic missiles back toward Israel, preemptively eliminating Iran's ability to do so. And when those operators on the ground surged into motion, the results were stunning. Although Israel hasn't disclosed the precise circumstances of their deaths, the attacks killed several of the most important figures in Iran's entire military, including Mohammad Bagheri, Iran's highest commander under the supreme leader, as well as the leader of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Hossein Salami. Israel eliminated the people in charge of Iran's combat air fleet, its air defenses, and its military intelligence, as well as several key deputies and over a dozen critical nuclear scientists. Also killed was the man who had been leading Iran's side of the nuclear negotiations with the United States, Ali Shamkhani. So much of Iran's critical command and control infrastructure was taken out that it's now believed that Iran's military response to Israel couldn't be quickly coordinated and ended up being both more delayed and more limited than Iran's military leaders had intended. As the strikes continued, Israeli intelligence was able to guide the nation's air power in real time. In one instance, Israel was able to pinpoint the locations of 8 elite members of the Revolutionary Guard Corps in an underground bunker, including the head of Iran's missile programs, and successfully strike their position. In another, when an effort to eliminate 10 nuclear scientists left one alive, the survivor was tracked down to a second location and swiftly taken out. All in all, Israel's first waves of strikes hit about 100 targets from the air, in addition to the sabotage and assassination operations happening on the ground. In exchange, although Iran claimed to have shot down several Israeli warplanes and some really bad AI-generated images circulated online trying to prove it, there's no evidence to suggest that Iran actually scored any hits against manned aircraft. Within hours, an Iranian response was on the way, utilizing well over 100 ballistic missiles, along with slow-traveling Shahed drones that arrived afterward in order to rain down across Israel and attempt to overwhelm Israel's air defense systems. Although most missiles were intercepted, some did strike populated Israeli areas, including a hit in Tel Aviv near a critical Israeli defense building called the Kira. One person was killed in Israel as a result of Iran's initial barrage, with over 60 others injured, although most people in the heaviest hit areas were able to get to bomb shelters in time. According to Israeli officials, a total of 24 people in the country were killed by Iran's strikes over the course of the conflict, with all of them dying in the earliest days of the Iranian retaliation. Overall, Israel's air defenses did prove capable of mostly nullifying the attack. In the immediate aftermath of that first exchange, both participating governments and the governments of the entire world took up their positions in advance of what was clearly to come. Iran vowed full-force retaliation against Israel in the coming days, including strikes against Israeli nuclear facilities, while condemnation poured in from Iranian allies in China and Russia. Neither of those Iranian allies, nor Iran's proxy forces in the Middle East, moved to respond, except Yemen's Houthi rebels, who launched only a single long-range missile toward Israel but threatened a return to attacks against Red Sea shipping. The United States vowed to punish any Iranian attacks that targeted American assets in the region, although the Trump administration declined to take part directly in the conflict at the time. With American air power already forward deployed across the Middle East, the threat of direct punishment for strikes against the US was a credible one, and Iran and its proxies did not elect to broaden their retaliation toward Israel's main backer. By all accounts, the global consensus was that the Middle East had moved into a new and never-before-seen phase of violence, with Israel and Iran now attacking each other directly at large scale, far beyond what either nation had attempted ever before. It's worth emphasizing, however, that Israel's initial salvo still left a lot of potential Iranian targets unscathed. Perhaps the most high-profile of them all was Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who wasn't directly targeted by any of Israel's early attacks. Nor were critical members of Iran's political leadership, its president, its foreign minister, or its defense minister. Iran's crude oil production was spared, as was Karg Island, where Iran loads over 90% of its oil exports onto tanker vessels. Other major economic targets weren't hit either, and Iran's other nuclear enrichment facility, the hardened underground complex known as Fordo, was mostly ignored. Similarly, Iran's retaliation posed genuine threats to Israel, but it too left clear openings to de-escalate. The critical Strait of Hormuz remained open, and in fact, Iran would leave it unobstructed for the entire duration of the fighting. But in Iran's case, it doesn't appear that the initial retaliatory strikes were kept relatively limited by choice. Instead, the combination of Iran's severely disrupted command and control architecture, its destroyed ballistic missile launches, and the immediacy of Israel's attack and the need to retaliate led to a far smaller attack than Iran would probably have planned. Iran didn't have 8 to 10 hours to fly thousands of kamikaze drones from Tehran to Jerusalem over 1,500 kilometers or nearly 1,000 miles in order to overwhelm Israeli air defenses and clear a path for its ballistic missiles to crash through. It didn't have the volume of ballistic missiles that it had counted on, not just because many of them couldn't be launched anymore, but because the people who were supposed to give the launch order, well, they were dead. The retaliatory strike that Iran did put together, pairing over 100 Shahed drones with about 150 ballistic missiles, according to Israel, did give some indicator as to what Iran could have done under more ideal circumstances. But it was a shadow of what Iran had promised and what Iran had been perfectly capable of just a few short hours prior. Okay. So when it came time for Israel to justify its strikes to the global press, it did so by leaning hard on the allegations that Iran was close to building a nuclear weapon. According to Israeli officials, internal intelligence suggested that Iran might have had enough uranium to fuel 15 warheads if it was enriched to weapons grade, and that it could have enriched that uranium in just days. Israel didn't deny that it would take Iran far longer to actually build a warhead. Instead, the argument was that strikes were necessary to ensure that Iran never got the chance to move past that point of no return. In a letter to the UN Security Council a few days later, Israel explained that its operation, quote, aimed to neutralize the existential and imminent threat from Iran's nuclear weapon and ballistic missile programs. Despite prior assessments of America's intelligence community, Trump himself would throw his weight behind Israel's claims within just days, turning heads domestically when he declared that his own director of national intelligence had been wrong in his prior assessments. According to the White House, in a statement issued before America entered the conflict directly, Iran was now judged to be able to have a nuclear weapon ready within just weeks. For posterity, it's important to note that that's roughly the timeline that intelligence officials had previously said Iran could produce weapons-grade uranium, which would again take several months to adapt into a working nuclear warhead. After the first night of attacks, Israel and Iran's exchanges of fire would continue for nearly 2 weeks straight. Although there were particularly notable attacks on either side, which we'll discuss in just a moment, the conflict quickly settled into a day-to-day rhythm that held mostly stable until a ceasefire went into effect. Broadly speaking, Israel transitioned from its initial nationwide attacks to a fast-paced but more targeted campaign of precision airstrikes. Relying on a combination of aerial intelligence and reports from the ground, Israel narrowed its strikes to destroy Iranian missile launchers, radar installations, and other air defense capabilities wherever mobile assets popped up. Israel's remaining warplanes were targeted quite thoroughly, and so were its stockpiles of long-range drones wherever they could be located. Israel kept up the pressure on Iranian nuclear sites, bombing them relatively frequently, and was able to operate in basically uncontested airspace. By contrast, Iran clearly lost much of its attack potency as time went on, and its forward-deployed missile launchers were identified and destroyed. Iranian manned aircraft never attempted an attack on Israel, and long-range drones were used relatively infrequently compared to what one might expect from how Iran and its proxies have acted in the past. Iran also seemed to favor expending its older missiles first, rather than relying on faster and more sophisticated munitions that might have stood a better chance at breaking through. Although this hasn't been directly confirmed by Iranian defense officials, Iran's waning pace of ballistic missile strikes and its relatively constrained counterattacks seem to have been a product of Israel's ability to consistently target and eliminate Iranian launch capabilities in real time. In order for Iran to launch several dozen or several hundred missiles at once, it would have had to move many of its remaining missile launchers, revealing their locations and opening them up to Israeli strikes. With Israel in full command of the skies, it wouldn't have made much sense to go to the trouble of mounting and preparing whatever advanced missiles did survive, only for them to be blown up before they got a chance to launch. As such, Iran was only launching missiles in the single digits in many of its attack waves, especially later, and those small barrages were in most cases intercepted easily by Israeli air defense. When it comes to the especially notable attacks by either side, the best place to start is with the strikes against the Iranian nuclear program. Israel severely damaged the Natanz nuclear enrichment facility, with multiple bombing runs making Natanz into a focal point of its efforts prior to the US getting involved. Open-source satellite imagery showed extensive damage to the surface-level portion of the facility, while the IAEA confirmed that there had been direct hits using bunker-buster munitions to destroy the underground areas where enrichment actually takes place. Israel mostly avoided an important nuclear complex at Isfahan, but it did target specific laboratories that convert gaseous uranium into a solid form after it's been highly enriched, suggesting that Israel was more focused on disrupting the production chain that would allow Iran to build a bomb than simply devastating everything with the word nuclear attached to it. Notably, Iran's nuclear enrichment site at Fordo remained largely untouched, as global media explained to interested observers that the deeply buried facilities at Fordo were one of the main reasons Israel so badly wanted to get the US involved. America's bunker buster bombs are the only weapons in Western arsenals that are capable of penetrating to the depths where Fordo's bunkers are buried, and we haven't quite reached that portion of the story just yet. Two Iranian targets that weren't spared by Israel were a heavy water facility in development called Arak and the country's only functioning nuclear power plant known as Bushehr. The Arak facility, in particular, hadn't come online yet, but there was clear potential for it to be used to produce plutonium for use in some types of nuclear bomb. Then there were the attacks against Iranian oil and gas infrastructure, including the Sharan oil depot in Tehran, with at least 11 storage tanks on the premises, plus a pair of important gas fields and a crude oil refinery. Those attacks, however, were not enough to meaningfully disrupt Iran's energy sector in the long term. They appeared more to be warning shots, demonstrating that Israel was willing and able to bomb that infrastructure if the conflict continued to escalate. Strikes against military targets only intensified. But by Tuesday, the 17th, Israel declared that it had destroyed a third of all of Iran's missile launchers and gained complete air superiority over the capital city of Tehran, meaning that Iran had little to no remaining ability to engage Israeli warplanes as they operated above the city. Elsewhere, Israel would strike Iran's notorious Evin prison, known to be the preferred location to incarcerate political dissidents and journalists, although Israel drew criticism for putting the lives of detainees at risk. And in one particularly symbolic act, Israel bombed a state news channel while the channel was broadcasting live on air, leaving the news anchor to first try and ignore the strikes and then end the broadcast to find cover. Coming back in the opposite direction, Iran was mostly unable to hit well-defended Israeli military targets where air defenses are even more concentrated than they are across the rest of the country. The nation did, however, strike civilian areas on several occasions, with 9 people killed and around 200 injured on the 15th, and 8 people killed and more than 90 injured on the 16th. Iran got close to hitting an oil refinery in the city of Haifa, which it targeted several times, and it destroyed numerous buildings across the nation, although in most cases the buildings were unoccupied due to air raid alerts. One particular strike that drew global headlines took place at Israel's Soroka hospital, where much of the hospital was destroyed by a ballistic missile, leaving 40 people injured. Nobody was killed in the attack, with patients already having been moved below ground in advance of it. Iran did seem to achieve one objective, forcing Israel to expend missile interceptors in large enough numbers that some Israeli defense sources indicated that there could be shortages on the horizon. Air defenses would ultimately not run out before a ceasefire was agreed, although it's unclear whether some of Iran's successful missile hits could have been due to individual defense batteries running low on interceptors. During the back-and-forth strikes, one of the most important questions to answer was on the status of Iran's supreme leader, who had disappeared quickly once the fighting began. According to Iranian news sources, the Ayatollah had made his way to a heavily fortified bunker outside of Tehran within just a few hours of the start of the attack. He was purportedly joined by his family members and became very hard to reach, fearing that Israel would be able to use electronic signals to pinpoint his location. Israel and the United States claim to have precise knowledge of Khamenei's whereabouts and the ability to eliminate him at any time, although America's administration in particular has repeatedly claimed during the course of the conflict that it is not interested in bringing about direct regime change. As the crisis continued, Khamenei reportedly granted his military commanders direct and complete control over Iran's wartime conduct, both to eliminate the need to communicate with the outside world for planning purposes and to insulate himself from the command and control infrastructure that Israel was looking to destroy. Instead, Khamenei reportedly set about replacing military officials as quickly as possible, while also selecting 3 senior clerics who he believed to be appropriate candidates to succeed him if he were killed. Those potential successors have not been named publicly, but one of them was expected to be elevated basically immediately in the event that Khamenei died. Among the people believed to be in contention were Khamenei's own son, a choice that Khamenei himself opposed, and a senior cleric named Hassan Khamenei, who's been seen as a widely respected reformer, although now that the supreme leader has survived the war, succession is again an issue to be solved another day. Khamenei is 86 and may still be receiving treatments for cancer, so an Iranian succession plan may unfold soon enough anyway. Notably, one thing that didn't happen during nearly 2 weeks of undeclared war was a ground battle. In fact, other than the sabotage and assassination operations carried out by Israeli intelligence, Iranian and Israeli fighters are not known to have crossed paths on the ground at any stage. Iran took precautions to deter potential Israeli commando raids, sealing off its deeply buried site Fordo in order to prevent Israel's special forces from gaining access. They also carried out a range of efforts to try and identify Israeli operatives at work in the country, albeit with limited success. Internally, Iranian officials repeatedly cut off or slowed down internet services, popped up numerous security checkpoints, and went on the hunt for Mossad collaborators, all in an effort to clamp down on Israeli intelligence operations across the country. Hundreds of people were arrested nationwide, including many who were accused of sharing pro-Israel content on social media. Others were accused of plotting attacks on Israel's behalf, which, considering the depth of Israelis' intelligence reach during the war, probably is not an unfair assumption. But Israeli and Iranian soldiers never faced off, their tanks and artillery never exchanged direct fire, and the nations in the middle, particularly Iraq and Syria, were spared the side effects of being caught up in a land war. And one other notable turn of events that didn't play out as some might have expected was the prospect of direct involvement from Iran's international allies. Iran's proxy forces in Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, and other Middle Eastern nations chose not to take part in the conflict, with a very small number of limited exceptions. Nor did Russia, China, or North Korea, three nations that have been observed strengthening ties with Iran. They didn't come to help the Ayatollah and his regime in their time of need. We've covered the inaction of both Iran's proxies and its international allies in a pair of dedicated episodes on this channel, so do check those out if you'd like to learn more about that. But to put it simply, none of those groups seem to have judged an intervention to be aligned with their interests. For Iran's proxy forces, that would have drawn intense military reprisals from Israel in a situation where the proxy forces themselves could do very little to substantively improve Iran's situation. In the case of Russia and China, direct intervention was neither something they were willing to devote resources to, nor something that they judged to be in alignment with their own interests. As such, Iran was left to weather Israel's assaults alone, and by all outward indicators, it was Israel that got the better of the 12-day-long exchange. By the end of the first week of Israel and Iran's open conflict, the question of American military involvement was growing ever more important to answer. Remember, not only is the United States Israel's main military backer, but it's also the only one of Israel's allies that possesses the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, a 30,000-pound bunker buster bomb with a 5,000-pound conventional warhead that's designed to burrow deep into reinforced concrete and explode with devastating effect. America is the only nation with the GBU-57 in its arsenal, and it's the only nation with the necessary aircraft to deploy that bomb, by way of the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. So for Israel, getting America involved militarily didn't just mean bringing America's formidable military strength to bear. It meant access to specific hardware to further Israel's specific military goals, and particularly the destruction of the specific enrichment facility that was most vital to Iran's nuclear program. In the days leading up to the strike, Washington, and particularly Donald Trump, fueled a highly visible, high-stakes game of will he, won't he. The US had given some indication that it might engage in military action, moving non-essential personnel out of the Middle East, issuing travel warnings, and repositioning military assets in proximity to Iran. On the days leading up to the strike, the US moved over 30 air-to-air refueling tankers to Europe, and on social media, Trump hinted that a strike could be coming. But Trump also stated that he wasn't yet convinced that a strike was the right idea, and that it'd take up to 2 weeks to decide whether or not to move ahead, placing a deadline that would imply that Iran could probably breathe easy for a few days. In hindsight, however, that statement appears to have been part of a larger head fake by the Trump administration. As before the strike actually took place, the US sent a number of B-2 aircraft flying across the Pacific toward Guam with their transponders turned on, meaning that their movement was highly visible for observers in the public domain. By that same time, however, the US had readied an even larger force of B-2s to participate in the actual strike, which they'd already agreed to carry out multiple days in advance. Iran seemed to suspect that the attack was incoming eventually, indicating in advance that it had moved nuclear material out of the Fordo and Natanz complexes and positioned it elsewhere. But it appears, in hindsight, that Iran did not accurately anticipate the timing of the assault. The airstrikes took place on June the 22nd, utilizing 7 B-2 bombers and a single nuclear-powered submarine, believed in retrospect to have been the USS Georgia. Dubbed Operation Midnight Hammer, which we'd make lots of jokes about if we weren't extremely professional serious war analysts, the raid involved a total of about 125 aircraft, including the B-2s, which were escorted by advanced American fighters, refueled in midair multiple times, and provided data by intelligence planes. The bombers executed the strike by way of a continuous flight from the US heartland, non-stop, for a total of about 37 hours. And yes, to be clear, B-2 pilots do have access to a small bathroom and galley on board, but the cockpit itself is rather crammed. 6 of the bombers targeted the Fordo facility, and the remaining B-2 targeted Natanz, while the nuclear-powered submarine in question launched 30 Tomahawk cruise missiles, targeting both the Natanz facility and a second site at Isfahan. It was the single largest stealth bomber strike in world history, the second longest duration strike mission ever performed by the B-2, and as it turned out, a showpiece of American military might. At Fordo, the B-2s dropped a total of 12 GBU-57s, and as satellite imagery has since confirmed, those bunker busters were able to strike and burrow inside the mountain above Fordo without detonating. Those bombs were also dropped in pairs in so-called double-tap strikes that allow them to overcome the limitations in burrowing ability that they still face despite their immense power. In a double-tap strike, a first bunker buster hits a target and burrows as far as it can before detonating, despite its target still being too well insulated for a single bomb to reach. Then, using finely tuned precision guidance, a second bomb drops through the same entry chasm that the first bomb created, traveling down through the burrow that's already been detonated, through rock or reinforced concrete that's now been loosened up, and traveling even deeper to explode on target. Satellite imagery from Fordo shows only 6 entry points in the mountainside, despite 12 bombs being dropped, suggesting that in all 6 attempts, the double tap worked precisely as intended. Elsewhere across Iran, the remaining B-2 dropped its pair of bunker busters on Natanz, reportedly hitting with precisely their intended effect. Tomahawk missiles devastated what was left of Natanz's surface-level facilities and destroyed much of the surface facilities at Isfahan. A large underground complex at Isfahan was not substantively impacted for unclear reasons, but the lack of an attempt to reach that complex with a bunker buster would indicate either that it wasn't a target of interest for the US or that even a double-tab strike wasn't expected to be enough to score a hit. While the B-2s were over Iranian airspace, 4th-generation US fighters presented their unstealthy airframes as decoy targets for any remaining Iranian air defenses to target, while 5th-generation stealth fighters prowled unseen, looking for enemy aircraft or any sources of radar that indicated a coming-in surface-to-air intercept. No such threats presented themselves, and every aircraft involved with the attack was able to return safely to base. As for the actual effect of the strike, that's been the subject of considerable debate in the aftermath. Iran reported no casualties since all the targeted facilities had been evacuated by the time the strike actually took place. But the real question is the extent of the damage to Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Now, we've done a separate episode diving deeper into that question, but suffice it to say that the Trump administration was not pleased when a classified intelligence report leaked to the global press indicating that the strikes had not achieved the full destruction of Iran's facilities as Trump and his administration had initially claimed. According to those assessments, although the facilities at Fordo and Isfahan did sustain serious damage, they weren't taken out of commission, and in fact, the damage that did occur might only have set Iran's nuclear program back by a matter of months. This was far from the, quote, completely and fully obliterated facilities that Trump had described, and although the White House acknowledged those less flattering assessments, it rejected them outright and insisted that the facilities were destroyed in their entirety. The administration has since claimed that new evidence contradicts that initial report supporting Trump's claims, although that news has been received with rather understandable skepticism. After America's airstrikes, the next question to be answered was whether Iran would follow through on its promises of severe retaliation. Iran had made it clear in advance that if the United States joined Israel's air campaign, its military installations, its assets, and its citizens would be considered fair targets. It would only take a day for Iran to make good on those threats, and just hours after the US ordered a shelter in place for its personnel in the nation of Qatar, 14 Iranian short and medium-range ballistic missiles zeroed in on an airbase called Al-Udeid. 13 of them would be intercepted by air defense systems, specifically the US-made Patriot system, while the last one was allowed to crash in an area where it was judged not to be able to cause any meaningful risk of harm or damage. But far from a serious attempt at reprisal, the retaliatory strike was a carefully managed affair, and one that Iran had alerted the United States and Qatar about well before it actually took place. The Iranian government and its state media hyped up the strikes at home, claiming to have devastated the American base and shown the Americans just what Iran was made of. But every detail of the retaliation was manicured to ensure practically zero risk of further escalation. The airbase that Iran had targeted had been mostly vacated by the United States several days prior. The missiles were intercepted by air defense teams who had taken hours to hold meetings, work out the specifics, and ensure that they were ready for an attack that everybody knew was coming. Trump himself would acknowledge that the Iranians had warned about the strikes well in advance, and having struck the nuclear facilities it had intended to, the United States made clear that Iran's toothless counterattack would not lead to a further exchange of hostilities with America. The worst fears of global experts when the conflict kicked off, from an attack on the Strait of Hormuz to a rapid enrichment of bomb-grade uranium to a major strike on the US, all appeared to have been successfully avoided. And once momentum toward de-escalation started rolling, the United States proved unwilling to allow the diplomatic inertia of war to be established. In a move that was profoundly uncharacteristic for a United States that had only just been attacked, Trump issued public calls for a ceasefire just hours after the attack on Al Udeid. First, he announced to the world that it was time to discuss peace. And then, without public confirmation from either side, he announced via social media that Israel and Iran had agreed to a total ceasefire set to activate within just 6 hours. Initially, the announcement was met mostly with bemused skepticism from a combination of Trump's bombastic and rather unorthodox overtures to both sides, the lack of validation from Israel or Iran, and a downright strange description of the ceasefire that seemed to give Israel a full 12 hours to strike Iran however it wanted, while Iran couldn't retaliate. But then, Iranian officials indicated that there really would be a ceasefire, and while the Israeli government didn't directly confirm it, reports from Israeli sources indicated that there really was agreement from Jerusalem's side. What followed over the next 7 hours was complete chaos. But despite a rather incredible number of opportunities to declare that all was lost, the situation just kept evolving, or as one of our own viewers commented on our episode after the ceasefire was announced, the situation sort of spiraled into control. Shout out to Moshe in the comments, by the way. That gave us a bit of a laugh. First, Israel intensified its airstrikes in what now appears to have been an effort to get as many last strikes in as possible before the deadline hit. Then came confusion about when the deadline actually was, with the consensus seeming to suggest for a little while that the ceasefire would start 3 hours ahead of schedule. Then, when that hazy new deadline passed, Iran launched no fewer than 6 small waves of ballistic missiles, striking a residential unit and killing 4 civilians, something that seemed almost certain to doom the ceasefire before everyone could even agree that it had started. Even worse, Iran's last wave of missiles seemed to come after the original deadline Trump had imposed, and Israel then struck an Iranian radar installation in a limited retaliation. But despite those early violations on both sides, the ceasefire somehow still managed to take hold. According to sources in Washington, it took a last-minute phone call from Trump to Benjamin Netanyahu to prevent a larger Israeli retaliation for Iran's final missile strikes, and Trump would take to social media yet again in all caps warning to Jerusalem, and we'll quote here, "Israel, do not drop those bombs. If you do, it is a major violation. Bring your pilots home now!" Said Trump on the morning of the 24th about the effort to establish a ceasefire, speaking to press as he was leaving for a NATO summit, quoting again, "I'm not happy with them. I'm not happy with Iran either. We basically have 2 countries that have been fighting for so long and so hard that they don't know what the they're doing. You understand that?" End quote. And by the way, in a strange turn of events, that comment by Trump set off a chain of cause and effect that would eventually lead to the leader of the NATO alliance deferring to him as Daddy. But that, like our less safe for work review of Operation Midnight Hammer, might be a story best for another day. After what Israel and American sources described as uncharacteristically strong pressure from Washington, Netanyahu elected not to pursue further strikes. From that point, there have been no subsequent attacks by either side as of the time of writing. Each nation involved has indicated that they consider the war to be over, and none currently show signs of re-engagement. A series of drone strikes in Iraq during the final hours of fighting have not been tied to Iran, and Iran has not been held responsible for any actions by its proxy allies in the aftermath. All in all, Iran has stated that 610 people were killed and over 4,700 wounded as of the time of writing, although the non-profit group Human Rights Activists in Iran suggests that over 1,000 people were killed, including over 400 civilians. Israeli officials have indicated that at least 29 people were killed in Israel during the course of the conflict, most of them civilians, and over 140 were seriously injured. In the aftermath, all sides have claimed victory and have allowed each other to do so. Israel has stated that it achieved all the objectives of Operation Rising Lion and then some, while setting back Iran's nuclear program as thoroughly as it had hoped to. Iran has claimed that its strikes against Israel and the US were enough to force its adversaries to the table and get them to accept a ceasefire on Iranian terms. The United States has lauded the performance of its military during the crisis, and the Trump administration has emphasized its own role in both destroying Iran's nuclear facilities, again a disputed claim, and securing a quick and lasting peace. On the other hand, there's reason to believe that each nation involved might have felt that they were reaching a breaking point. For Iran, the level of destruction that Tehran has withstood has been immense. And with so many of its ballistic missile launchers and air defenses destroyed, it had little to no hope of waging a long-term version of the war that Tehran and Jerusalem were fighting. Sure, it could reveal its remaining military assets and launch a huge one-time attack that would devastate Israel, but Israel would still be standing, and the retaliation would be so much worse than what Iran had experienced at that point. Similarly, Iran could try to march its land army toward Israel, but good luck getting far in unprotected airspace in a situation where America would almost certainly come in to ensure that Iran never reached the Israeli border. And while Iran could try to shut down the Strait of Hormuz or enrich uranium to weapons grade to try and threaten the world, those actions could have very easily backfired and gotten the entire world on the same page that Iran and its rogue government had to be dealt with once and for all. On Israel's side, unconfirmed reports have suggested that air defense interceptors were on the verge of running low, and that a large Iranian strike, if Iran was crazy enough to try it, really could have led to mass devastation. Not only that, but with Israel rapidly expending its stores of American-made munitions, it was rapidly losing its leverage in Washington, with the White House now able to use the threat of withholding arms shipments as a way to gain compliance from Netanyahu. But really, it shouldn't be a surprise that neither side would want to touch on those inconvenient issues when they could instead raise their fists high, declare victory, and claim that their mortal enemy has been made to tremble at the very thought of their power. And with Iran and Israel now both making it pretty clear that they'd rather not bring about total Armageddon in the Middle East, neither side seems to have much of a problem with the other side saying that they've won. Whether or not this crisis ends up becoming remembered as the 12-Day War, the broader impact of these 12 days will ripple across history for decades at a minimum. Remember, this exchange was the culmination of decades of a Middle Eastern Cold War between Iran and Israel, decades of fear about an Iranian nuclear program, and decades of diplomatic efforts that had prevented the Middle East from reaching this point. And it's important to remember, even after the dust has settled, that there's a reason that this conflict has been delayed for so long. In the grand scheme, even despite everything that happened during those 12 days, the world got lucky. No nuclear weapons were deployed, no new nuclear weapons were developed, a blockade of oil didn't crash the global economy, neither side assassinated each other's national leader, and the crisis didn't turn into a larger regional war. Tensions are still high, and it's too early to say that the Middle East got away clean. But it sure got away cleaner than it might otherwise have. Now that the missiles have stopped flying in all directions, the next task for Iran, for Israel, and the entire world is to learn about this new Middle East that's been created. Some of the old rules are certainly going to be rewritten, others will probably stay the same, and perhaps most importantly, neither side will fully understand the new rules of engagement until there's been a good bit of trial and error. How Israel and Iran approach each other in the future, how each of them approaches the rest of the world, and how the rest of the world approach them will only be revealed in time. But we can make some early observations, starting with the nation of Israel. In the aftermath of this engagement with Iran, which it seems fair to say at this point that Israel quite decisively won, Jerusalem has defeated the proverbial final boss that it's been building up to during nearly 2 years of war in Gaza, Lebanon, and elsewhere. Israel's operations against Hamas are still ongoing, it's unlikely to be done with the Houthi rebels anytime soon, and Iran may pose a potent threat again in the future, but at least for now, Israel has proven that none of the Middle Eastern armed forces that were willing to challenge it can stand up in a direct fight. Perhaps that'll open the door to the normalization efforts that seem to have kicked this whole thing off, finally allowing Israel to integrate economically and politically with the Middle East's richest nations, now that the question of its rivalry with Iran has been temporarily settled. Or maybe it'll be the opposite, a situation where the governments of the Middle East are unable to engage with Israel in that way because their people's animosity toward Israel has only grown after it defeated a major Middle Eastern power player. Just as important is the future of Israeli domestic politics, and particularly the future of Benjamin Netanyahu, a man whose alleged crimes might be forgiven by an Israeli public that sees him as the man who slayed the Iranian dragon, or a man who might get no such grace. For the United States, as well as Israel, there are still lingering questions about Iran's nuclear program. Both nations have decided, at least for now, that enough is enough. What if America's early damage assessments are correct and Iran's nuclear program was only set back a few months? Nuclear material and centrifuges are believed to still be in circulation, hidden away or barricaded in places or where they could be accessed at some point soon. Will the two nations have to get the band back together and do this all a second time before 2025 has even ended? And will Netanyahu, and especially Trump, end up paying the price for having declared mission accomplished a little bit too soon? One of Trump's recent predecessors knew that pain all too well, and if Iran rebounds quickly from this war, Trump might yet experience it too. Then again, Trump also has an opportunity to re-engage Iran in nuclear negotiations, now on much more favorable terms, with the circumstances ideal for America to extract major concessions and for Trump to work his way toward the Nobel Peace Prize that he seems to crave. For Iran, the nation has been seriously degraded, but it hasn't been defeated. If the controversial American assessments are right, then perhaps its nuclear program can be restored. But the status of its military, that's another matter entirely. Iran will have to rebuild its air defense apparatus, its ballistic missile launch capabilities, and its axis of resistance all from the ground up. And that's if Iran wants to rebuild those capabilities at all. Iran was unique in modern geopolitics for its intense focus on cultivating a proxy network and its dependence on missiles and drones, where most nations chose to just build up a strong conventional military. Iran couldn't do that because of the crush of Western sanctions against it, but it didn't have to answer that challenge with ballistic missiles and foreign paramilitaries. Perhaps Iran will choose to rebuild in a new way, or perhaps the country's faltering economy won't be able to sustain a rearmament at all. There are a lot of ways that this next chapter of the story can go, where Iran never returns to the military potency that it had before Israel's offensive. And its efforts to reconstitute its forces, they're going to be made all the worse by a mess of domestic factors that will have to be considered. Not only will reconstruction be a long and expensive process, but Iran is going to have to find a way to stay economically viable. The Trump administration seems eager to offer some lifelines, but those lifelines will tie Iran to Western financial interests in a way that'll make it more risky for the nation to pursue its larger geopolitical goals. The Iranian regime already faces strong internal opposition, and if it gets too cozy with the West after taking such an obvious beating, it may lose the support of its hardliners too. In that world, the Iranian people could very well bring about the regime change that Israel and the United States decided not to force. Not only that, but the nation's military leadership has been gutted. The Ayatollah is talking succession, and any conversations about personnel now will have to account for Israeli intelligence. How much does Tehran really want to bet that Israel hasn't ensured that its own cultivated intelligence sources, its informants, its assets, and even its secret supporters are the people who've risen through the ranks and are now ready to assume command? Which of Iran's ambitious mid-level leaders are poised to play a greater role in Iran's future thanks to the wave of high-level deaths that Israel brought about, while simultaneously being in Mossad's pocket? While these questions can only be answered with time, it does appear that Iran might be receiving an olive branch from the West, particularly the United States, in the near future. At this stage, the second-term geopolitical approach of Donald Trump can best be summed up with the rather reasonable assumption that no matter who they are or what they believe, world leaders would prefer to get rich instead of getting shot at. Already, Trump has signaled that he'll take a similar approach to Iran, emphasizing Iran's potential to start selling oil to global markets again and highlighting the nation's historical status as a world leader in trade. In a Trumpian approach to the issue, an Iran that can reintegrate to the global economy peacefully will both receive positive financial returns as a reward and be more willing to avoid future violence because they could put those financial returns at risk. Whether Iran will actually respond to that sort of economic persuasion, we'll have to wait and see. But it's worth noting that the very change that led Iran's proxy forces to provoke the last few years of global conflict was the prospect of Israel and Saudi Arabia opening up their economies to each other, while Iran and Saudi Arabia looked at doing the same. If Iran's own proxy groups feared years ago that economic integration could rewrite regional relations in the Middle East, then it stands to reason that they were onto something, and that economic cooperation might really lead to strategic realignment. But really, that's rather uncharacteristically optimistic for us here at WarFronts, isn't it? And no matter what sorts of possibilities seem to be on the horizon, only history is going to reveal what actually ends up coming true. Right now, we're back to the grand tectonic shifts of global geopolitics as Israel consolidates its power, Iran begins to reconstitute its forces, and America walks away with its arms raised in victory. When that situation evolves, and when the next cycle of upheaval inevitably arrives, we'll be back to talk about it. Until then, thanks for joining us in our latest coverage of the Israel-Iran war, and thank you for watching.